Hi, I'm Helen Bauer, and this is the Heart of Hospice podcast. The Heart of Hospice podcast is your source for compassionate and informative discussions about hospice and end-of-life care. I'm a certified hospice and palliative care nurse with over 15 years of experience. Whether you're a caregiver, someone with a serious illness, or you simply need to know more about hospice care, this podcast is for you. Join me as we explore all the aspects of hospice, from the details of caregiving to the emotional and spiritual dimensions of end-of-life journeys. For more resources and to connect with me, visit theheartofhospice.com and find us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. Keep listening for today's episode.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time. Content presented in the following podcast is for information purposes only. Views and opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of the host and guest and may not represent the views and opinions of the Whole Care Network. Always consult with your physician for any medical advice, and always consult with your attorney for any legal advice. And thank you for listening to the Whole Care Network.
This episode of the Heart of Hospice podcast is being sponsored by bkbooks.com. Barbara Carnes and her team at BK Books have created the Approaching Death Support Kit to help educate and support families with clarity and compassion. This new bundle is a practical, ready-to-use resource for the bedside and includes many of Barbara's most trusted booklets. For more information, visit bkbooks.com or see the show notes for the link to bkbooks.com.
I'm talking with Dr. Robert Macauley today about his work as a pediatric palliative care doctor and how sick kids have changed his life. Dr. Robert Macauley is Cambia Health Foundation Endowed Chair in Pediatric Palliative Care at Oregon Health and Science University. He was a pediatric hospitalist in Connecticut and director of pediatrics at Kaluva Hospital in Uganda before joining the faculty at the University of Vermont, where he directed both the Department of Clinical Ethics as well as the Pediatric Advanced Care Team. He holds a Master of Studies in Philosophical Theology from Oxford University, a Master's of Divinity and of Sacred Theology from Yale Divinity School, and a Master of Fine Arts in Fiction from Vermont College of Fine Arts. His work focuses on pediatric palliative care, clinical ethics, and spirituality. Dr. Macauley has published articles on topics ranging from civil disobedience in the practice of medicine to the role of surrogate decision-making following a suicide attempt. His memoir, titled Because I Knew You, How Some Remarkable Sick Kids Healed a Doctor's Soul, came out in June of 2025. Pediatric palliative care is a fairly new specialty in the medical world, and Dr. Macauley explains more about the work that he does. He gives a great explanation. To help families who are struggling with medical terminology, Robert will often advocate for the families so that they have a clearer understanding of what's happening. Communication is key in the work that Dr. Macauley is doing, and he talks about how using the phrase yes and can be beneficial in communicating with emotional intelligence. He's also a medical ethicist, if I can say that right, and he shares the importance of ethical decision-making in pediatric palliative care. He ends our discussion by explaining what keeps him in this work in the pediatric palliative care realm, even when it's difficult and sad. I hope that you're ready for this one. We've got a trigger warning on this episode because we're going to be talking about sick kids. It's really valuable, but it's also a very moving, intense conversation. So stick with me. There's a lot to learn. Dr. Macauley, Welcome to the Heart of Hospice podcast. I'm so glad to talk with you today.
Thank you for having me. It's a delight to be here.
Well, I am thrilled to have you on the show, and I always send it over a set of questions, but I keep one question to myself. Like to surprise my guests as a little bit of an icebreaker, get to know you a little bit. So here's your question, and I think for you it's going to be an easy one. Tell me about something in your work that gives you great joy.
Well, this may come as a surprise to some, but I think the thing that gives me the greatest joy is when a family says, we don't need you anymore. And I think the reason I say that is that a lot of people associate palliative care with the end of life and dying, which it is part of what we do. But especially in pediatric palliative care, we oftentimes get involved early on in a patient's life, not just at the very end. And we have some amazing treatments out there. And as we help a family navigate complexity and walk a very difficult road, there are some amazing stories that I've experienced with the families that I've worked with where they have reached a point where they say, I think we're good, that their child is either getting better or stable, or they've addressed what they needed to address. Maybe they circle back with us one day if they need us again. But when someone says, we don't need you anymore, that's a sign they're doing really well. And hopefully we've contributed to their doing really well in the meantime.
Yeah. It's kind of like when your doctor says, I'm breaking up with you. I don't need to see you anymore. Yeah,
Yes.
That's a good thing. I like that. So you work as a pediatric palliative care physician.
I do.
And let's face it, there are a lot of people that don't know what palliative care is to begin with. And then you've tacked on the pediatric part of it. And in addition, you work in the ethics realm as well. But
Yes.
So tell my audience what you do as a pediatric palliative care physician.
Yeah, so pediatric palliative care is a relatively new specialty. A lot of people don't even know it exists. And those who do probably choose not to think about it too much because it conjures sad images of kids who are struggling. And no kid should ever get sick. Certainly no kid should ever die. Unfortunately, that happens, and they deserve really great care when that happens. And that's what the team I'm a part of and other people in my field focus on. So we get involved in the care of kids who are facing serious illness. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily dying. Doesn't mean that they're at the very end of life. It may mean that they are facing a difficult path. Their parents may be facing difficult choices as they navigate a complex medical establishment and trying to figure out what's the right thing to do for their child. We also recognize that some treatments and some conditions cause a lot of suffering, and kids shouldn't suffer. So we try to make sure that we keep their symptoms under control and try to find the right balance of managing symptoms with allowing them to lead their best life for as long as they possibly can. And ultimately, we recognize that it's a difficult path to walk for the child, for their family. And so that's why I say that I'm part of a palliative care team, because you can't really say as a physician, like, I do palliative care, because you can't do it by yourself. You need nurses and social workers and chaplains and art therapists. And we are fortunate where I am at Oregon Health and Science University to have a wonderful palliative care team. And we've been doing this for long before I got here, and we'll continue long after I leave, and try to make sure kids don't suffer. We try to make sure families feel supported, and we try to make sure that we provide, the technical term is goal concordant care. So we figure out what parents and families hope for. We try to figure out what they're afraid of, and we give them advice about how to get to where they want to go and try to avoid where they don't want to go.
So that's interesting. To create a plan that's in accordance with their goals, you find out what they hope for and also what they're afraid of.
Yeah, that's a trickier question to ask. So an analogy I sometimes use is parents, because most of the time it's parents making decisions for their child. Like if a child's old enough to participate in decision making, certainly we involve them, but a lot of our work is skewed very early in life, even into the neonatal or even prenatal sphere. So those kids obviously are not going to be taking part in discussions. So what I often say is parents are the captains of the ship. They decide where they're trying to go, and we're sort of the navigators. We give them advice about the best way to get there and the way to avoid hazards along the way. And when I ask families what they hope for, they kind of look at me pretty commonly and say, "Are you really asking that? Like, what are you really asking?" Because we doctors, we usually say things like, especially as pediatricians, we're like, is your kid pooping and peeing okay? They're not
Right.
used to me
The
asking them,
basics.
like, exactly, what are you hoping for? And when I reassure them, yes, I am really asking that question, then you can imagine what their answer almost always is, which is, I want my kid to get better. And if I were to say, okay, thank you, then I actually haven't learned very much, because I kind of knew that at the beginning, because that's what every parent hopes for. So then we ask them what else they're hoping for. And then they give me an answer. And then I say, okay, and what else are you hoping for? And we go down that road. And there was a study done a few years ago of parents of kids with cancer. And they found that when you do that, parents are able to identify an average of 7 distinct hopes. And some of them you might imagine, as I just said, my kid gets better and is cured. And some of them go along with that, like leads a happy, healthy life and gives me grandkids one day. But some of them are not consistent with that. Some of them are things like that I hold them as they die. And so it shows that for every time someone thinks, oh, these parents, they don't get how sick their kid is, I think every parent gets how sick their kid is. They just may not want to talk about it at that moment, but part of their brain is processing that. And so the reason we do that is if there comes a time when we can't achieve their number one hope, if we've identified others, then we can say, look, I don't think we can get to that one, but you said this was also important to you. And then we focus on that. But to go to your question about worries or fears, that's an even less commonly asked question, I think, of families, because it's a scary question. At the same time, parents are afraid of a lot of things, understandably. Like every parent is afraid of a lot of things for their kid, because you want your kid to be okay and you wonder what's going to happen to them and you want to protect them. And so if we don't ask what they're afraid of, then we don't really know what things to specifically avoid. And we do the same thing. And it could be, go down the list. What else are you worried about? And obviously losing one's child, but it could be my child feeling alone, my child experiencing pain. So for some families, it's my kids, other kids not being able to say goodbye. So there's a lot of things in there that if we don't ask, we'll never find out.
Yeah. And those are hard questions to ask. Really hard questions. So I'm struck by your answer and the track we're already on for the conversation, because one of the things that I highlighted in your book has to do with denial. In hospice and palliative care, we talk a lot about people not being ready. They're in denial, and we get why that happens, right? We get that. But you have a quote in your book that says, even if denial is a crutch, you better not take it away before you give that person something else to lean on, or they'll fall down. And that's really where palliative care comes in, having those conversations. But if you never ask where they are in their mindset about things, how can you provide them with a crutch or something else to put in place once you remove that denial?
Yes, and I certainly don't want to claim credit. I think that's an old spiritual care adage that I quote in the book. So it's not an original saying. I do come back to it frequently, though, because, as I said before, I think most people are getting it on some level. They may not want to talk about it. It may appear to be denial on the surface, but there's a lot of processing going on under the surface. And I also think this is specifically and especially relevant to pediatric palliative care, because it's unjust. Like, it shouldn't happen.
It's unnatural.
It is completely unnatural.
Yeah.
And so I don't mean to say that losing someone's 80-year-old grandparent is not a sad event. I don't mean to make light of that. At the same time, I think we all realize that all people are mortal. Everyone is going to die one day, but ideally that's after they've lived a full and fulfilling life. And so that's why in adult palliative care, folks can do things like life review and dignity therapy and different modalities to sort of help someone realize what a full life they've lived. You can't do that with an 8-year-old. Like, an 8-year-old should be out playing baseball with their buddies. They shouldn't be in a hospital. They shouldn't be facing a life-threatening illness. And so that's one of the things that I see sometimes when very well-intentioned people who work in the adult sphere, they come in, if they're called into the pediatric environment, they sometimes, to my mind, pivot a little bit too early to trying to draw some good meaning out of a tragic experience and confronting that denial a little bit more than I would choose to. Because when a parent is living in what some people would call denial, I don't think it really is, but if some people would call it that, that probably is their self-defense mechanism at that moment to say,
Sure.
I'm not ready to confront the tragic injustice of what is happening to my kid who deserved none of this. And I think our task is to sit with that for a really long time until we sense that the parents have had a chance to share that and know that we acknowledge that. Because if there's ever even a semblance of suspicion on their part of, oh, this team is trying to get me to move on before I'm really emotionally prepared to move on, I don't think that typically goes well. And it doesn't set us up as a resource and a support structure for them because they may not feel like we get where they're coming from.
Don't you think it might not create a sense of trust? You know, if the team's goals are not in alignment with what the parents want, I can't trust you to do what's in the best interest of my kid because obviously you're headed in a different direction.
I completely agree. And so that's why we try really hard to understand where the parents are coming from. And a lot of our work in palliative care is trying, like, for lack of a better term, sometimes I feel like we're either mediators or translators between the family on one side and the sort of medical establishment on the other. I think that there's a benefit in my role. Like, I am I focus on palliative care, but I'm not a technical subspecialist. Like, I'm not a pulmonologist. I'm not a neonatologist. And so when I engage with a family that is dealing with these incredibly learned physicians and medical teams who have such deeper knowledge than I do in those areas, I feel like on some level, my lack of granular knowledge can be an asset because I keep my eye on the big picture simply because I don't necessarily understand all the granularity of all that's going on, but I can communicate that in a way that I hope parents can understand and can bridge that gap between the sort of more technical aspects of medicine and the heartfelt aspects that the parents bring to the conversation.
I talked with a social worker from the Stanford Healthcare Palliative Care team, and she said the exact same thing, that when there was a case conference, the family's there, the team is there, she often served as a translator of sorts, and the fact that she didn't actually ask because she didn't understand, she was really asking for the parents, but in turn, she also learned as well. It helped to clarify, to help the medical team clarify their explanations to the family. And the palliative care social worker and the other palliative care team members would ask for those explanations. You know, what I hear you saying is, or can you expand on? And so they became advocates in a lot of ways, is the way she described it. And that's what I hear you saying.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think it creates actually some rather interesting dynamics, though, because I do the same thing. And I try not to explain for other professionals because I think that can be viewed as sort of showing someone else up. And I certainly don't want to do that. But there have been many times where we've been in a larger conversation. We call it a care conference, where we have a bunch of different medical professionals in a room with the family. And one of them will use a term that I'm pretty sure the family is not getting. Like, they'll talk about pressors, and I'll say, what pressors? With a question, and I'll let them explain that that's a medicine to increase blood pressure. But when people haven't worked with me before, I think they kind of look at me like, is this guy really a doctor? Like, how does he not know what pressors are?
Is he just stupid? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Did I miss that day in medical school or that month? So I was like, no, and sometimes I'd say, I kind of knew what that was. I just felt like the family wasn't getting it. And then over time, I think people get where I'm coming from.
Right. It's sort of a go-between, a bridging relationship. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the beauties of palliative care. But I want to talk about that because one of the stories you've written in the book is about the first time you were called in. You were working in Vermont. You had a physician call you in. And basically what they wanted you to do as the pediatric palliative care doc was to get a do not resuscitate order from the family, which you did not do.
I think I tried, but I did not succeed.
Right. And the physician was put out with you because
Yes.
that was really his goal, and you didn't come back with it in hand. I think, would you agree that we have a tendency to use palliative care teams for those tasks when really their role is so much more expansive, or can be so much more expansive than that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that whenever I or our team meets with a family and I come back and say, I think that we should proceed with maximal intervention, people kind of look at me like, are you really the palliative care doc? Like, that's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to talk about like de-escalating treatment and focusing on comfort. And my response is, actually, I think my goal is to figure out what's important to this family. And if their position, if what they hope for their child is that we provide maximal treatment in the hope of improvement, cure, remission, whatever it might be, my job is not to persuade them otherwise if that is a reasonable goal. Like, there are certain times where it is very clear that that is not an achievable goal. And then in that situation, my task over time, our task as a team, is to help them understand that and to grieve with them over a goal that is noble and worthy and cannot be achieved. In most cases, though, especially as we begin a relationship, if that's where they're at, then that's where we're at. And it's only over time that we potentially are able to shift the conversation in a different direction, while also hoping with them that this actually works. Like, I think that there's increasing use of improv in palliative care in terms of improvisational comedy training. And one of the great exercises in improv is to do an exercise where you're talking to somebody, and after they finish talking, you say, yes, but, and then you have to finish that sentence, and you go back and forth, and you see how that feels. And it feels terrible. It feels dismissive. It feels disrespectful. And then you do another exercise where you say, yes, and you can say whatever you want after the but or the and, but it's a way of reinforcing that if you yes, but somebody, actually use that as a verb. If you yes, but somebody, this conversation is not going well, because essentially what you've done is you have erased or devalued everything that came before. All that you take. If you say yes, but that just means I'm trying to persuade you of something that you don't want to believe, or I'm not respecting what you just said to me. And so we try very hard not to yes, but people. If someone's in a place, we try really hard to understand that place. And then it's only if we're in the same place with them that we can start walking a journey together and have real conversations once they trust that we are going to respect where they are.
So there's momentary, very momentary validation. Yes, but, right? It's very momentary.
It's really just an agenda. Like, yes, but reveals an agenda. And if we walk into a room with a family and we have an agenda, then I think it's going to be hard to do our job well in a way that is respectful for families. And so we try not to.
We're going to break for just a minute. This isn't the end of the episode. There's more to come, so stay connected.
The sponsor for this episode is bkbooks.com. When someone you love is dying, the journey can feel overwhelming. What do? What should you expect? How can you help? Barbara Carnes, RN and end-of-life educator and hospice pioneer, created the Approaching Death Support Kit to bring clarity and practical guidance to the bedside.
Hi, this is Helen, host of the Heart of Hospice podcast. As a hospice nurse, educating the family has always been a top priority for me. The Approaching Death Support Kit from BK Books provides families and caregivers with clear, practical guidance to help them navigate the end-of-life journey with confidence and compassion.
The bundle includes many of Barbara's most trusted booklets, Gone From My Sight, By Your Side, The 11th Hour, Pain at End of Life, and her newest title, Always Offer, Never Force. Whether you're a nurse, social worker, chaplain, or end-of-life doula, this kit supports your work. And for family caregivers listening, it offers gentle, trustworthy guidance to help you care for someone at home and feel more prepared for what's ahead. BK Books offers quantity discounts for teams, agencies, and families, so visit bkbooks.com to explore the Approaching Death Support Kit. See the show notes for this episode for a link to bkbooks.com.
you have a unique set of skills from your background because you're also an ethicist.
Yes.
And you have a degree in theology.
Yes.
So you are a minister as well, a pastor.
Yes, I'm an Episcopal priest as well.
Yes. So that's quite a blend. When do ethics come into play in the work that you do?
They come in pretty much all the time, I think. Ethics in the pediatric context, I think, in some ways are different, arguably more complex than in the adult context, especially when it comes to medical decision making. If for adults, ideally, an adult patient has the ability to make their own decisions. We give them options. They make a decision. We respect that. Autonomy is a prized concept, especially in American bioethics and American healthcare.
Yes.
For children, it gets more complex. As I said before, oftentimes the patient is not making their own decisions. And also, it doesn't make sense for a small child to imagine what they would say if they could. You do that with adults. Like if you have a full-grown adult who is temporarily unable to make decisions, we ask questions like, what was important to them? What were their values? What do you think they would have chosen if they had a chance at deciding? It doesn't make sense to say that about a newborn. You can't really say, what would this newborn say when they hit 18 and they're legally an adult? Because who knows what their values are going to be. So then we are working with the parents, and the parents are trying to make decisions. The parents also have other responsibilities, maybe towards other children. They also are looking out on some level for their own grieving process and not wanting to live with regret. They are making decisions for another person as opposed to a patient making decisions for themselves. So it gets very, very complex. And that's one of the reasons why ethical decision making is one of what they call the 8 domains of palliative care. There was this thing called the National Consensus Project that looked at the 8 things that palliative care does. Ethical decision making is one. I think one of the challenges in what we do is trying to figure out when we need extra assistance in the ethics sphere, because there are ethics consultation services that have a slightly different role in palliative care. And one of the challenges that we run into is, when do we ask for extra help and when do we feel like we can manage this on our own? So there's ethics in pretty much everything that we do. The question is, when it gets really thorny and really complex, how do you make that decision and who do you call in for extra assistance?
So one of the stories that you have in the book is about a woman named Gloria and her son, I think it's Tony.
Yes.
Her son, which was a pretty significant case. There's probably not enough time we could spend the whole podcast on talking about this one story, but suffice it to say is she basically refused to have certain treatments, comfort measures provided to her child, to the point where you took legal measures.
So this was a patient who was recovering from a neurologic illness and was experiencing extreme pain. And his mother's belief was that she did not believe in certain potent pain medications, especially opioids, for fear of addiction or things like that. And despite our best attempts to talk about the extremely low risk of that happening and the tense impact of pain on his both current and future life, she continued to refuse. So after many, many attempts at persuasion, we felt that this constituted medical neglect. And part of certain roles, depending on which state you're in, certainly physicians are in that category of mandated reporters. We are mandated to report if we have reasonable cause to believe that medical neglect is occurring to the Department of Children and Families for investigation and potential authorization to provide the care that we felt like we needed to give. In that case, DCF did not substantiate the report. And what that means is that they investigated and did not feel like it rose to the level of medical neglect, in part because this was not a life-threatening situation. Most situations in medical neglect are, if you don't do this, the patient could die. He was not going to die for lack of treatment. He was just going to suffer horribly for lack of treatment. And I felt that rose to the level of medical neglect. And I look back on that case with true regret. I wish we could have done so much more for him. It was hard to watch him suffer, and I'm sure first-person experience was a million times worse than whatever I happened to feel by watching that. And it raised fascinating and complex questions about what to do in terms of his mother. There were some members of the team who said we should just say she can't come to the hospital and we should do what we need to do when she's not here. They were driven by very noble concern for this patient. It wasn't like they were dismissive in any way. They were actually saying, look, we need to take drastic steps to care for this patient. And my opinion in that case was that I understood where they were coming from, but I also felt that the degree of isolation and deprivation of his most beloved relative, his mother, could have contributed to suffering in its own right. So I think that was a case of very concerned clinicians disagreeing about what the right thing to do was. And I'm still in awe of his courage in navigating an intensely difficult situation. And I don't know what happened to him. I hope he's okay. But he battled bravely through something I wish he didn't have to face.
What a delicate balance to have to weigh to make decisions. Yeah, yes. I mean, ethics are like that, right? In those situations, we don't start having conversations with our ethics teams unless there's a situation that calls for it. And they get sticky and they get dicey, and it's hard to find your way through situations like that.
I totally agree. And some people have called ethics the search for the least bad option. Because if there was a good option, somebody would have already come up with it. So now you're forced to choose between a bunch of not great options, and then you have to find the one that's least bad. And that's a difficult task.
Yeah. You have something in the book that you're speaking with someone and basically want to know their perception of what you do. And your friend says, you take a really shitty situation and make it less shitty.
Yes.
Yeah.
and he was quick to qualify that, because when I ran that chapter by him and I said, look, I'm quoting you, he's like, well, we need to clarify that. So I think there is a footnote in there to be like, he actually went on to say, because that can come across as a little snarky or a little dismissive in some ways. And he was like, no, like what I really meant to say was, you take a really hard situation and you walk us through it. But it was in the moment when he said that, I'm like, that's actually one of the better explanations of what I do that I've heard in a long time. Yeah. Now, granted, when I introduce myself to people, like when a family's like, what do you do? I clearly do not use that definition, because that would be an awkward way to begin a conversation. But when I've shared that with my colleagues at other institutions, they're like, oh yeah, that's actually a pretty good description.
I don't know. I think some parents might relate to that, because I'm pretty sure they already know they're in a shitty situation, that it's a bad situation. And if you can make it a little bit better, then there you go.
I think so too. It's also probably not the best recruiting tool for the field of palliative care, because I think that most people go into medicine because they want to cure folks. Like, we're fix-it people, we doctors at least are fix-it people. And so when I say I take a shitty situation and make it less shitty, then I think a lot of people are like, well, I aspire to slightly more than that. I'd like to cure somebody somewhere along the way. I'm like, I'm envious if you can. I just don't happen to do that in my work.
Right. Yeah. The slogan for palliative care is, we might help you a little bit. It's not exactly inspiring. So I can see that. So speaking of being inspired, tell me a story about when you were inspired by one of your patients or a caregiver, because the stories in this book are amazing, from the patients to their parents, their relatives. Tell me about one of your stories that inspires you.
As you said, there are many in the book. I think the one that I frequently come back to is Grace, who I cared for several years. She had been dealing with a very bad kind of cancer for about a decade. And it finally got to the point where we ran out of treatments. The oncologist caring for her did an incredible job. There always seemed to be something more to try, and eventually got to the point where there was nothing more to try. And she was coming up on her senior year in high school, likely wasn't going to get there. It was the end of her junior year, and she was missing out on a lot of important things in life. And her life expectancy was becoming very short. And one of the things she always wanted to do was see Broadway. She was an incredible actress. I actually attended some of her high school performances. She had this incredible stage presence, and she wanted to see Broadway. And I didn't know how to pull that off, because even though we were only about a 5-hour drive from New York, I thought to myself, like, she's in such pain that even a 5-hour drive is going to be too much for her. She's not going to be able to tolerate that. And enter some incredible people who are clearly more creative than I am. And they hatched this remarkable plan where they reached out to a local foundation who was willing to literally loan us their corporate jet for the weekend. They got Make-A-Wish involved, who bought tickets to Broadway. They somehow reached out to the cake boss, Buddy Valastro himself, who said, come by the studio. And so one weekend, we got on a plane, me, Grace, her mom, a nurse taking care of her, and then at the time, a nursing student who came up with this plan, remarkably, named Beth Schiller. And we hopped on this plane, flew to New York, went to see the cake boss. Buddy stopped production, hung out with Grace, gave her all kinds of bling, featured her in some video shots, which were remarkable. Drove to New York City. She went to see Wicked. They gave her a backstage tour of Wicked. She has these incredible photos of her with the cast. And the next day, carriage ride through Central Park, wandering through FAO Schwartz, like the greatest toy store in the world. And it was this remarkable weekend. And we flew back to Vermont. And she went home, and she had a terrible pain crisis and came back to the hospital that night. And she died in the hospital the following day. And I have been inspired by that story ever since. I was inspired by her even before that story, because she was facing a terrible illness that she should not have been facing. And she battled through that and spoke her truth about what she wanted out of life. And a lot of people, in my experience, not for their lack of courage or anything like that, but because of how severe their illness is, they sort of fade away a little bit, because that illness takes some things from them and they can't do the things they want to do. And they live with some sense of regret in that moment. And Grace didn't. She lived this amazing life, right? Literally up until the very end. And I'll always remember a week later, I went to her memorial at her school. And, this is a kid who missed a ton of school because she was in the hospital so much because she had a really serious illness. She couldn't go on the class trip to Europe, which nearly broke her spirit because she was in too much pain. And the gym was packed. This is a kid who missed so much school that I was amazed that people knew her, but tons of people knew her. Tons of people loved her. She made such an impression on so many people. And I've always thought about that when I think about living life to the fullest. And she did, right up until the very end, battling a ton of pain, pounding through that, speaking in what she needed, leaning on people when she needed to lean on them. And I carry that with me. That was 13 years ago. So still carry that with me.
That's a beautiful story. The way you wrote about it in the book, one of the most famous songs from the musical Wicked is
For Good.
But I have been changed for good. I've been changed for the better. And that's where the title of your book comes from.
So I have to give credit where credit is due. So that was not the original title of the book. The original title of the book was drawn from a different Broadway show, another one of my favorites from Rent. And the original title was I Can't Believe This Is Goodbye. And that lyric does appear in the book, but it's no longer the title because my center daughter, Lucy, said, you can't call it that. It's too depressing. No one will ever buy it. I think that's a horrible title. And then my oldest daughter, Katie, jumped in the act. She's like, well, how about Because I Knew You? So she pivoted from one Broadway musical that I loved to a different Broadway musical that I love. And so that's how Because I Knew You became the title. And so I got to give credit to two of my daughters where credit is due.
That's perfect. Rely on your center daughter, because you don't call her
Exactly.
She has a separate identity. You don't use the word middle daughter for her or middle child. You say she's your center daughter. I love it.
Yeah, she So she's the only one of our four kids who just sort of not have a unique identity. We have the oldest, the youngest, and the only boy. And I never wanted her to sort of be just the middle of anything, nor would she stand for that. If you knew Lucy, she would not tolerate that. So I didn't have much of a choice anymore.
She sounds pretty awesome, pretty fierce.
She is.
So when it comes to palliative care, the general public really doesn't know a whole lot about palliative care and what it is as a specialty. And unfortunately, it's very tightly associated with hospice and end of life. Although people in the know in healthcare know that palliative care can be utilized way before end of life issues are a concern. What misconceptions are you still encountering among other healthcare workers?
I'm fortunate here at OHSU in Oregon to work with a lot of, I think, very enlightened and progressive people who I don't have to face a whole lot of misperceptions. More broadly speaking, I think a lot of people still associate palliative care with end of life only. They associate it sometimes with giving up and not fighting hard, which it's not part of the work that we do. And so there may be a reluctance to bring palliative care in because that they fear that this will tell the family that people are giving up on their child, or that it is necessarily the end of life when it may not be. And so, and in the common sphere, in the public sphere, as you said, a lot of people outside of medicine also have misperceptions. First of all, palliative is a weird word. Like I sometimes say when I'm teaching medical students, have you all ever used the word palliative in normal conversation as opposed to saying, in the technical sense of palliative care, like that seems like a palliative thing to do, and never had anybody say that they actually use it in conversation.
Right.
Which is actually an interesting point. So a lot of people don't know sort of the common reason or the modern reason why it's used as a term. So the modern hospice movement started in the UK in the 1960s. And there was a really amazing physician from Montreal named Balfour Mount who went over there to say, what's up with this? And is this a good thing? And he brought the notion of hospice care back to Quebec, where he practiced in Montreal. The problem with that is that the word hospice in French has a connotation of caring for people who have no one else to care for them or nowhere else to go. And so a lot of people didn't want that because they're like, I have friends, I have family. This is, painting me in a negative light. So he said to himself, well, we have to come up with a new term that doesn't have any connotation. So let's choose palliative because no one knows what that means. So he chose it specifically because no one knew what it meant. The problem is now it has connotations attached to it over time. And there's actually a really interesting debate going on, has been for a long time in palliative care, especially in pediatric palliative care, as to what to call ourselves. So if you notice what palliative care teams are called, like in most adult hospitals, they're called a palliative care team. Pediatricians sometimes come up with euphemisms to avoid the word palliative. So a very common one is the Pediatric Advanced Care Team, or PACT. So many people try to stay away from the term palliative. Other people feel like we should talk about it front and center, like we're palliative care, this is what it is. My usual approach is to not use that term at the beginning, but to talk about what we do and then to do what we do. Like I'll ask about goals, I'll talk about worries, I'll talk about symptom management, I'll talk about what families derive strength from and how we can bolster that, talk about spiritual care. And then when we're done with all that conversation, I'll say something like, and by the way, we're the palliative care team, and this is what palliative care is. And I find that to be more effective than defending ourselves at the outset rather than showing what we are throughout a conversation.
Interesting concept. I know here in Texas, there's an intentional language choice to call it supportive palliative care. Supportive palliative care. That's the technical term the state would like to see us use.
There was a study in Texas that came out about 5 years ago where there was a very large adult hospital in Texas, and they did a study where they changed the name of their palliative care team from palliative care to supportive care. They made no other changes, and they had a 50% increase in consultation over the next 6 months.
Yeah.
And so some people are saying, well, we should just call palliative care supportive care. And my usual response is, it took a little while for palliative care to get a negative connotation associated with end of life only. It'll only take a little while for supportive care to get the same connotation. We better take this head on rather than trying to dodge it.
Yeah. Yeah. People are not stupid. They can figure this out pretty easily.
Mm-hmm.
So let's get a little personal, if you don't mind. With the work that you do, I mean, obviously some of this is very heartbreaking. You work with some of the most fragile infants, newborns, and even help in prenatal situations. What part of your work as a palliative care doctor would you say you struggle with the most personally?
I think for me, I have 4 kids, and I think that probably the hardest cases for me are the ones that have specific resonance with one of my own children. So I don't know what families go through when they are facing the life-threatening illness of their child, because I have not experienced that in my own life. I spend a lot of time imagining that, and I think I do a pretty good job of imagining, but it's not anywhere close to actually living that.
Right.
In situations where there is a profound similarity, though, I feel like I get closer in my imagining. And even just imagining and getting a little bit closer can be really, really hard. Early on in my career in this field, I would sort of actively imagine that. I would try to put myself in those parents' positions. And a very wise friend of mine, who's also a very experienced psychotherapist, when he heard that, he's like, "You got to stop that, man. You can't do that." Human beings are not meant to lose their child. They're not even meant to think about losing their child, because that is just so overwhelming and profound. So I don't actively do that anymore, but I feel like through my own personal journey, it happens a little bit more organically. And there are times where I have been very close, sort of from a structural or kind of intuitive standpoint, to what a family is going through. The one example that jumps to mind is not in the book, that happened while I was writing the book. There was a patient who was pretty much the exact same age as my oldest daughter. And I got called in to help. This is a patient who had suffered from cancer from a very early age and was now dealing with heart failure related to her earlier cancer treatment. And at the time was about 18 years old. And her parents had split up, and her dad was sort of her primary rock. She lived with him, and he was there all the time in her room. And the two things that leapt out to me, one was for a variety of reasons, both related to her condition and also other trauma that she had endured. I have never in my life been in a room where the pain was as palpable as in that room. It was like as if we walked into the room and were flooded with suffering by virtue of what she was sharing or what she had gone through. And she was pretty much the exact same age as my daughter, who has had her own battles in life and challenges, but nothing on the same order as this patient. And then seeing her dad, who some people interpreted as not furthering her healthcare because he wanted to have a hand in everything, and sometimes said, "You can't come in my daughter's room." And I thought to myself, I would be that way. I would be this dad.
Yeah.
And he was like, "We got to get her home. We're not letting her die in this hospital." And we have certain procedures in the hospital. You got to check boxes. I'm not saying that in a negative way, but to help somebody be safe and help somebody be comfortable. And he's like, I don't care. He wasn't doing it willy-nilly. He wasn't doing dismissively. He was like, "We're not going to make this perfect because she might die here if we try to make it perfect. We're going to take what we've got and we're going to get her home." And we worked really hard together to do that. And we got her home. And she had a few weeks at home with her family that were incredibly meaningful before she died. And that was 4 years ago. And he and I are still in close touch, and we get together regularly. And part of it was because I saw myself in him. And I think in some ways he saw himself in me. So those are the ones that are among the hardest, when it's not a leap to put myself in that person's position. I can't get there. I don't mean ever to say that I know what they feel like, but I'm closer than I otherwise am. And I think I'm close enough to feel a little bit of what they're feeling, a little bit. And even that can be overwhelming.
Yeah. I think every end-of-life worker can find a death relatable. I mean, we're all going to die, so the death of another human being is relatable in one way or another.
Mm-hmm.
But I know as a parent, to begin to empathize and to place myself into those situations, it can be crippling for somebody who's providing care to engage that deeply.
Yes.
Yeah. What keeps you in this work? What's your why these days?
Well, I wrote a reflection a couple of years ago that a lot of people kind of look at me funny when I tell them the title, but it really encapsulates the answer to your question. So the piece was called "The Selfishness of Pediatric Palliative Care." And people are like, really? That doesn't make any sense. Because when I tell people what I do, they sometimes go down the road of, oh, wow, you must be this most amazing, selfless person to put yourself
You're a saint.
in emotional harm's way. Yeah, I'm like, no. Like, I think I'm a pretty good guy. I like to think I'm a pretty good guy. But I do this work, first of all, because it is important work. It needs to get done. And there aren't many people who want to go into this field for a lot of understandable reasons. But it's not like I'm some noble person who sacrifices himself every day and does important work and comes home heartbroken and just sucks it up and does it again the next day. Like, as I say in the book, I would not know how brave and honest and generous human beings could be if I didn't do this work. That I went through a lot myself, as I talk about in the book, as a child. And the kids and parents that I work with restored my faith in people and in humanity. And I look at them and I think to myself, wow, I didn't know people could be that way. Like, and when I don't say that very often to them. And when I do, they brush it off. They're like, I'm just doing what I have to do. I'm like, oh, come on. Like, the courage that you show and the openness and the generosity and the willingness to have your heart broken. Like, and when I go to sleep at night, I have a lot of cause for sadness, but I also have a ton of cause for hope because of what they've shown me.
I love that. So tell my audience, before we close, where they can find the book and who should read it. Who is it for?
Well, I like to think it's for most people that want to understand more about what courage and honesty and bravery and family is all about. It's not a technical book. I would imagine some people in my field would be interested in reading it. It is, I think, the first book to really tell the stories of kids receiving palliative care. At the same time, those folks in the field, they do this every day. They may feel like, I do this. I don't need to read about somebody else doing it. So the goal is to tell others, the broader world, about what pediatric palliative care is and what it is not. So it's not a technical book. You don't need to be a medical professional to understand what's going on. It's written in lay language.
Right.
And it deals with a lot of things. So it deals with the families, their stories, tells their stories. It also deals with hard decisions. We mentioned ethics earlier in the conversation. It deals with faith and my own journey of faith as an Episcopal priest, confronted with things that should never happen. And I think that ideally it helps some incredible kids, their stories, to be known more, because they deserve to be known. They didn't deserve what they got from an illness point of view. They do deserve to be remembered and their stories to be told. And there are a lot of stories in the book, like Grace's story, that I think are incredibly inspiring. And I'd love other folks to know these kids too, a little bit, the way that I knew them.
It's wonderful. So I want to read the lyrics from the song from Wicked. I've heard it said that people come into our lives for a reason, bringing something we must learn, and we are led to those who help us most to grow if we let them, and we help them in return. And the song closes and it says, because I knew you, I have been changed for good. I think, because I know you, Robert Macauley, I have been changed for good, and I hope that everybody that's listening to this interview has been changed for good as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Howard, so much.
I'm so proud I didn't cry.
Well, I think I did. So at least one of us.
Thanks for listening to the Heart of Hospice podcast. Check out our sponsor in the show notes, and please leave a rating and review on Apple Podcasts. We would appreciate it if you would share this episode with your friends and family and anyone who needs to know more about hospice. Connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, no matter who you are or where you are in your hospice journey, you are the heart of hospice.
This is the Whole Care Network. Helping you tell your story one podcast at a time.